Picture a courtroom in northern England 4 centuries ago. Stone walls, cold and damp. The year is 1612, and a woman stands accused of murder, not with a blade or poison, but with words. With witchcraft. The woman's name is Jennet Device, and she's screaming. Not in rage, exactly, but in desperation. Because the person testifying against her, the voice that will seal her fate, belongs to her own daughter. A 9-year-old girl named Jennet. The court officials try to calm Elizabeth, but she won't be silenced. She knows what's about to happen. She knows that once her daughter speaks, there's no turning back. Finally, they remove Elizabeth from the courtroom, dragging her back down to the dungeon beneath the castle. And then something extraordinary happens. The little girl, Jennet Device, who moments ago was sobbing, suddenly composes herself. She climbs up onto a table in the center of the courtroom so everyone can see her. And in a clear, steady voice, she begins to speak. What Jennet said that day would lead to the deaths of 10 people, including her mother, her grandmother, her brother, and her sister. It would change the course of witch trials not just in England, but across the ocean in colonial America. And 20 years later, the very precedent she set would come back to ensnare her. This is a story about how fear transforms us, how words can become weapons, how children can be both victims and instruments of injustice, and how, in times of crisis, entire communities can convince themselves that evil walks among them. It begins in a place called Pendle, in the shadow of a brooding hill, where poverty and superstition created the perfect conditions for tragedy. Lancashire in the early 1600s was what authorities called a dark corner of the land. This wasn't just poetic language, it was a genuine assessment of a region that the Crown viewed with deep suspicion. London was far away, both in distance and in culture. The roads were poor, communication was slow, and Lancashire had a reputation. It was known for harboring Catholics at a time when Catholicism was increasingly seen as treason. It was known for people who clung to old ways, old beliefs, old loyalties. And rising from the Lancashire landscape was Pendle Hill, a strange, imposing presence that seemed to watch over everything. Even today, it has an otherworldly quality. 400 years ago, when people still lived in fear of supernatural forces, it must have seemed almost alive with possibility and threat. At the base of this hill, in a dwelling so miserable it was called Malkin Tower, and Malkin was actually an old word meaning dirty or slovenly, lived the Device family. Old Demdike was the matriarch. She was what people called a cunning woman, someone who knew charms and remedies, who could supposedly heal the sick or find lost objects. In a world without doctors for the poor, without police, without social services, cunning women filled essential roles. They were herbalists, midwives, counselors, and yes, sometimes they claimed powers that went beyond the natural world. But there was a dangerous ambiguity to being a cunning woman. The same knowledge that could cure could also, people believed, curse. The same charms that brought good fortune could bring disaster. The line between white magic and black magic, between healer and witch, was terrifyingly thin. Living with old Demdike was her daughter Jennet Device, the woman with the crooked eye that contemporaries described in such cruel terms. Elizabeth's husband had died years earlier, leaving her with 3 children, Alison, James, and little Jennet. And here's something important about Jennet. She was different from her siblings. She was illegitimate, born after her father's death, the child of some unknown man. In that time and place, this would have marked her, made her feel separate, perhaps unwanted. The runt of the litter, as some historians have noted. The family survived through begging, through odd jobs, and through old Demdike's reputation as a cunning woman. They lived on the absolute margins of society, barely getting by. But they had neighbors in similar circumstances, another family headed by a woman called Old Chattox, who was also known as a cunning woman. And between these two families, there was bad blood. The Devices believed that Chattox had killed Elizabeth's husband through witchcraft. For years, they'd been paying Chattox protection money, offerings of oatmeal to keep her from using her powers against them. The year they stopped paying, Elizabeth's husband died. Now, to our modern ears, this sounds absurd. But to them, it was simply how the world worked. Curses were real. Magic was real. The supernatural was woven into the fabric of daily life. And in 1612, this local feud between two poor families was about to explode into something much, much larger. March 18th, 1612. A cold spring day. Jennet's older sister, Jennet Device, was walking along a road when she encountered a peddler. Peddlers were traveling merchants who carried their wares in packs, selling small items, ribbons, needles, pins, to people in rural areas who couldn't easily get to market towns. Alison, being a beggar, did what she'd done countless times before. She approached the peddler and asked for some pins. Just a small charity, something he could easily spare. But the peddler refused. He wouldn't even open his pack for her. He simply walked on, brushing past her as if she didn't exist. This was nothing unusual for Alison. People ignored her, dismissed her, treated her with contempt almost every day. She was poor, she was female, she was from a family with a bad reputation. Being refused charity was part of her ordinary existence. But on this day, Alison did what many people did when faced with rudeness or rejection. She cursed him. Not just swore at him, she actually cursed him, calling upon whatever powers she believed she had to strike him down. And then something terrible happened. The peddler collapsed. Right there on the road, he fell, unable to move properly, unable to speak clearly. His face twisted, his arm hung useless. Eventually, people found him and carried him to a nearby inn. If we were to see this man today, medical experts would immediately recognize what happened. The suddenly twisted face, the paralyzed left side, the slurred speech, these are the classic symptoms of a stroke. A medical event that can be triggered by sudden emotional stress, by a spike in blood pressure, by the physical strain of carrying a heavy pack and walking all day. But in 1612, Jennet Device knew exactly what had happened, and it terrified her. She had caused this. Her curse had struck him down. She rushed to the inn where the peddler lay, and she begged him for forgiveness, convinced that her witchcraft had nearly killed him. Think about that for a moment. Alison genuinely believed she had this power. Whether she actually did or not is beside the point. She believed it. And that belief, that contrition, that desperate need to confess and seek absolution would set everything else in motion. Because the peddler's son was outraged. His father had been struck down by a witch, and something had to be done about it. He reported the incident to the local magistrate, a man named Roger Noel. And Roger Noel was exactly the wrong person, or perhaps, from his perspective, exactly the right person to receive such a complaint. Roger Noel was ambitious. He was a committed Protestant in a region full of Catholics. He was a man who understood that his career, his reputation, his path to advancement lay in rooting out threats to the established order. And in 1612, the established order was very much under threat, or at least it felt that way. Just 7 years earlier, Catholic conspirators had tried to blow up King James and his entire parliament in what became known as the Gunpowder Plot. Guy Fawkes had been caught, tortured, executed. But some of his fellow conspirators had fled, and they'd fled to Lancashire, expecting to find shelter among the Catholic families there. The king himself had recently published a book about witchcraft, a learned treatise called Demonology, in which he argued that witches were real, dangerous, and deserving of death. The Bible itself commanded, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." So when Roger Noel received a complaint about a woman who'd caused a man to collapse through witchcraft, he saw an opportunity. This wasn't just about one incident on a road. This was about demonstrating his loyalty, his competence, his zeal in protecting the realm from evil. He began investigating. And Alison, terrified and guilt-ridden, confessed to everything. But she didn't stop there. Perhaps trying to shift some of the blame, or perhaps genuinely believing it to be true, she accused her neighbor, old Chattox, of using witchcraft to kill 4 people. The investigation was escalating. Chattox and her daughter, when questioned, pointed the finger right back at the Device family. They said that old Demdike was a witch, that she'd been practicing for decades, that she'd taught her children and grandchildren the dark arts. Noel realized he wasn't looking at a single incident anymore. He was looking at what he believed to be a conspiracy of witches, a coven operating right under his nose in Pendle. On April 2nd, he made his first arrests. Alison Device, old Demdike, old Chattox, and Chattox's daughter were all taken to Lancaster Castle to await trial. But the story was far from over. Good Friday, 1612. While Alison and old Demdike sat in a cold cell in Lancaster Castle, back at Malkin Tower, Elizabeth Device threw a party. Now, what exactly this gathering was has been debated for 400 years. Was it just an Easter celebration? A meal shared among poor neighbors? Was it a meeting of family and friends to discuss what to do about their arrested relatives? Or was it, as the authorities would later claim, a gathering of witches plotting to blow up Lancaster Castle and free the prisoners? What we know is that about 20 people came to Malkin Tower that day. To feed them, Janet's brother James stole a sheep. There was food, there was company, there was conversation. A local constable heard rumors about this gathering. He arrived at the house with his men and arrested everyone present. But Elizabeth, perhaps trying to protect some of her guests, told the constable that there had been others at the party who'd already left. She named them. So those people were hunted down and arrested too. In the space of a few weeks, Roger Noel had gone from investigating one incident to rounding up more than a dozen people on charges of witchcraft. And among those arrested were some surprising names. Alice Nutter was from a respectable, landowning family. She wasn't a beggar like the Devices. She wasn't known as a cunning woman. But she was suspected of being Catholic, and in the fevered atmosphere of 1612, Catholic sympathies and witchcraft were easily conflated in the minds of authorities. Think about Roger Nowell's perspective. If he could demonstrate that this conspiracy included not just poor vagrants, but also members of prominent Catholic families, he would be proving something larger about the threat to the realm. He would be a hero. By the time he was finished, Nowell had sent a total of 12 people from Pendle to Lancaster Castle to await trial. They joined several other accused witches from different parts of Lancashire. The cells were tiny. 20 people crammed into a space 20 feet by 12 feet. Dark, cold, filthy. They would wait there for 4 months before their trial began. And during those 4 months, old Demdike died. She never made it to trial. She simply perished in that miserable cell, an old woman who'd lived her whole life in poverty and would die in even worse conditions. As for 9-year-old Jennet Device, she didn't go to prison. We don't know exactly where she spent those months, but it's likely she was in the care of Roger Nowell, being prepared for the role she would play. Because Nowell had a problem. He had accusations, he had suspicions, but he needed proof. He needed witnesses. And there was one witness who could tie it all together, who'd been present at Malkin Tower, who could identify the guilty. A 9-year-old girl who was about to change history. August 18th, 1612. The assizes, the travelling court sessions, had come to Lancaster Castle. 2 judges presided, and taking careful notes of every word spoken was a clerk named Thomas Potts. The notes Potts took would later be published in a book, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, and that book is why we know this story in such extraordinary detail. Potts dedicated his book to Thomas Knivett, the man who'd arrested Guy Fawkes 7 years earlier. The message was clear. Just as Knivett had uncovered a Catholic plot to destroy Parliament, so these trials were uncovering a conspiracy of witches and Catholic sympathizers threatening the realm. The courtroom would have been packed. Witch trials were public spectacles, opportunities for the community to see justice done, to witness the power of the law and the church working together to root out evil. The first to be tried was Jennet Device, Jennet's sister. And Alison didn't even try to defend herself. She was utterly convinced of her own guilt. She told the court everything, how she'd cursed the peddler, how he'd fallen, how she knew she'd caused it through her powers. The peddler himself was brought to court, still paralyzed from his stroke. The judges asked Alison if she could heal him, restore him to health through the same magic that had struck him down. Regretfully, she said no. Her grandmother, old Demdike, might have been able to help, but Demdike was dead. Thomas Potts had some sympathy for Alison. She was young, she was sorry, she was completely broken by what she believed she'd done. He described her as genuinely contrite. But he had no sympathy for Alison's mother, Elizabeth Device. He described her in the cruelest terms, mocking her crooked eye, calling her odious and deformed. And then came the moment that would define the entire trial. They brought in a witness, a child, 9-year-old Jennet Device. Elizabeth Device was furious when she saw her daughter being brought into court. She must have known immediately what was happening, what was about to unfold. She started yelling at Jennet desperately. Was she trying to warn her? Trying to stop her? Trying to make her understand what her words would mean? And Jennet, this 9-year-old girl, burst into tears. She turned to the judge and asked that her mother be removed from the courtroom. She couldn't speak, she said, with her mother screaming at her like that. So they dragged Elizabeth away, back down to the dungeon. And once her mother was gone, once Jennet had the full attention of the court, something changed. She stopped crying. She climbed up onto a table so everyone could see her clearly. And she began to testify. Her voice was calm, clear, steady. "My mother is a witch," she said. "And that I know to be true." She described how she'd seen her mother's familiar spirit, a demon in the shape of a brown dog called Ball. She described how her mother had asked this demon to kill people, and the demon had obeyed. She described the gathering at Malkin Tower on Good Friday. She listed names. She described what they ate, that stolen sheep, and what they discussed. According to Jennet, they were plotting to blow up Lancaster Castle and murder the jailer. The parallels to the gunpowder plot would not have been lost on anyone in that courtroom. Jennet's testimony was devastating in its detail and its certainty. Thomas Potts wrote that although she was very young, it was wonderful to the court how she delivered this evidence with such modesty, such understanding. But she wasn't finished. She testified against her own brother, James, saying he'd been a witch for 3 years, that she'd seen his familiar spirit kill people. She recited charms she claimed to have heard him use, strange, half-remembered fragments of prayers and folk verses twisted into something darker. Think about what was happening here. A 9-year-old child testifying against her mother, her brother, her grandmother's memory, sending her own family to the gallows. Why would she do this? We'll never truly know. Maybe she was terrified and thought cooperating was her only chance of survival. Maybe she'd been coached, prepared, her testimony shaped by adults with their own agenda. Maybe, as some historians suggest, she genuinely believed her family were witches and wanted to distance herself from them. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, maybe she'd spent her whole short life feeling like an outsider in her own family, the illegitimate child, the unwanted one, and this was her moment of power. Her moment to matter, to be important, to be heard. Whatever her motivations, the impact was undeniable. But Jennet didn't just testify against her own family. The judges brought in other prisoners, mixed them with random people from the castle, and had Jennet identify them. One by one, she picked out the accused. "You were there. You wore a pretty dress. You sat next to me." They even tried to trick her, asking about someone with a made-up name. "Did you see Joanna Style?" "No, sir," Jennet replied calmly. "I never heard of her." She couldn't be shaken. She was the perfect witness. And she was only 9 years old. Now, legally speaking, there was a problem with Jennet's testimony. The law at the time said that children under 14 couldn't be sworn under oath, and therefore couldn't serve as credible witnesses. But King James, in his book Demonology, had specifically addressed this issue. He wrote that in cases of witchcraft, which he considered treason against God himself, the normal rules should be relaxed. Children, wives, even servants could testify, because witchcraft was so serious and so hidden that you needed to use every possible source of evidence. The judges in Lancaster were clearly following the king's guidance. They believed, or at least they acted as if they believed, that Jennet was telling the truth. and based largely on her testimony, along with some physical evidence, like the teeth and clay figure found at Malkin Tower, the jury found 10 people guilty of causing death or harm through witchcraft. Elizabeth Device, Alison Device, James Device, Old Chattox, Anne Redfearn, Isabel Roby, Alice Nutto, Jane Bulcock, John Bulcock, Catherine Hewitt. 10 people condemned to hang. The day after the trial, they were taken to a place still known as Gallows Hill. This wasn't a private execution. It was public theatre, a demonstration of the power of law and the consequences of evil. They didn't die quickly. Hanging in 1612 meant slow strangulation, which could take 20 minutes or more. Sometimes friends or family would pull on the legs of the condemned to hasten their death, to make it merciful. The condemned were expected to confess at the very end, to save their souls if not their bodies. But we are told that Elizabeth Device never confessed. Neither did Alice Nutto. Right to the end, they maintained their innocence. And Jennet. It's very possible she was there, watching. It would have been considered appropriate for the key witness to see justice carried out. Imagine that. A 9-year-old girl watching her mother, her siblings, her neighbors die because of words she'd spoken. But the story doesn't end there. Because Jennet's testimony did more than kill 10 people in 1612. It changed the law itself. 6 years after the Lancaster trials, a legal handbook called The Country Justice was published. It was written by a man named Michael Dalton, and it became the go-to reference for magistrates throughout England and in the American colonies. If you were a magistrate or justice of the peace, you weren't necessarily trained in law. You needed practical guidance, and the Country Justice gave it to you. In the section on witnesses in witchcraft cases, Dalton cited a specific example. He referred to Thomas Potts's book about the Lancaster trials, and he specifically mentioned that a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old, Jennet and James Device, had given sworn testimony against their mother, and that this testimony had been accepted by the court. What Jennet did in 1612 became legal precedent. Magistrates across England and in colonial America would use this handbook, and they would see that children could testify in witchcraft trials. The power of her words extended far beyond that courtroom, far beyond her lifetime. But there's an bitter twist to this story. Because the precedent Jennet set would eventually come back to destroy her. 21 years later, November 1633, a 10-year-old boy named Edmund Robinson came home late one evening to his family's farm in Pendle. He told his parents a wild story about why he was late. He'd been picking berries, he said, when he saw 2 greyhounds. He tried to get them to chase a hare, but they wouldn't, so he beat them with a stick. Then one of the greyhounds turned into a woman, a witch, and the other turned into a boy. The witch turned Edmund himself into a horse and rode him to a barn at a place called Horse Stones. Inside the barn, he said, were maybe 60 witches. They were pulling on ropes hanging from the ceiling, and amazing food came falling down. Edmund got scared and ran away, and the witches chased him. On his way home, he met a boy with cloven hooves, a demon, and fought him. His parents, astonishingly, believed this story. Or at least, they believed it enough to see an opportunity. Edmund's father began taking the boy from village to village, having him stand in churches and point out the witches he'd seen at that gathering. For 3 months, this went on. Edmund would stand on a stool, look around the congregation, and point. Her, and her, and him, on the basis of this child's bizarre tale about shape-shifting dogs and flying food. About 20 people were arrested and put on trial in February 1634. One of them was named Jennet Device. She was accused of killing a woman named Isabel Nutter through witchcraft. And while we can't be absolutely certain it's the same Jennet from the earlier trial, it's not an uncommon name. The coincidence is almost too much to be coincidence. The same families, the same region, the same accusations. It seems very likely that the 9-year-old witness from 1612 was now the 31-year-old defendant in 1634. The child who'd sent her family to the gallows was now standing in the dock herself. But England had changed in 21 years. King James had died in 1625. His son, Charles I, was now on the throne, and Charles was far more skeptical about witchcraft than his father had been. There'd been a turning point, actually, a specific case in Leicester in 1616. A boy had claimed to be bewitched, and 9 women were hanged based on his testimony. The very next month, King James personally interviewed the boy and discovered he was lying. The judges were severely rebuked. Word went out to be much more careful in witchcraft cases, especially when the main witness was a child. By 1634, the intellectual climate was shifting. This was the age when William Harvey discovered how blood circulates through the body. When scientific thinking was beginning to replace superstition. When evidence was starting to matter more than fear. The trial of the 1634 Pendle accused followed a similar pattern to 1612. Edmund Robinson testified. The jury believed him. 17 people, including Jennet Device, were found guilty and sentenced to death. But the judges weren't satisfied. Something didn't sit right. They referred the case to London, to King Charles and the Privy Council. 4 of the condemned, including representatives of the accused, were sent to London for further examination. Jennet stayed behind in Lancaster Castle, where several prisoners were already dying of jail fever, what we'd now call typhus. And in London, something remarkable happened. The 4 women sent to London were held at the Fleet prison, where, for a penny or 2, curious Londoners could come gawk at them. Witches from the north, come see them. Meanwhile, a pair of playwrights quickly wrote and staged a play called The Witches of Lancashire, based on Edmund's story. You could visit the accused in the morning and watch a play about them in the afternoon. It was complete entertainment. But while the public was being entertained, something more serious was happening. King Charles ordered his personal physician, William Harvey, to examine the accused women. William Harvey is one of the great figures in medical history. He's the man who discovered circulation, who understood how the heart pumps blood through the body. He represented the new scientific approach to understanding the world. King James's book, Demonology, had said you could identify witches by looking for special marks on their bodies, teats where demons or familiars would suckle. The accused from Lancashire had all been examined for such marks, and supposedly suspicious ones had been found. On Jennet Device, the examiners had noted two paps or marks in her secrets, probably meaning exactly what you think it means. But when William Harvey assembled a team of 5 physicians and 10 midwives to re-examine the women using proper medical knowledge, their conclusion was very different. Almost all the supposedly suspicious marks were deemed to be completely natural, just ordinary variations in human anatomy. Nothing supernatural at all. There was no physical evidence of witchcraft. Everything rested solely on the word of Edmund Robinson. And under questioning by the Privy Council and the Secretary of State, Edmund cracked. He admitted that he'd made it all up. He said his story was inspired by tales he'd heard about the Device family and the witch feast at Malkin Tower 20 years earlier. His father, he confessed, had been using him to blackmail women, accusing anyone who wouldn't pay them to keep quiet. The Robinsons, it turned out, had acquired some fine new cows through this scheme. Jennet Device and the others were acquitted. The girl who'd testified so calmly and convincingly in 1612 had survived to face her own accusation in 1634. And she'd been saved by the very thing that had condemned her family, skepticism about children's testimony. We don't know what happened to Jennet after her acquittal. There are some prison records from 1636 suggesting that some of those acquitted of witchcraft were still imprisoned in Lancaster Castle. Inmates had to pay for their board and lodging, and the debt had to be cleared before they could leave. For someone as poor as Jennet would have been, that might have been impossible. She may have died in that same castle where her family had waited for trial 24 years earlier. Or she may have walked free, returning to Pendle to live out her days in obscurity. We simply don't know. But her legacy lived on 3,000 miles away. In 1692, witch trials convulsed the town of Salem in Massachusetts. 19 people were hanged. Most of the evidence came from children making accusations. And on the table of the Salem magistrates was a copy of Dalton's Country Justice, open to the section citing Jennet Device as precedent for accepting children's testimony in witchcraft cases. A 9-year-old girl in Pendle in 1612 helped shape how witch trials were conducted in colonial America 80 years later. The power of her words echoed across time and space. So what are we to make of this story? On one level, it's easy to dismiss it as the product of a credulous, superstitious age. We know witches aren't real. We know curses don't cause strokes. We know demons don't appear as brown dogs and obey commands to kill. But I think that misses something essential about human nature and about how communities respond to fear. The people of Pendle in 1612 genuinely believed in witchcraft. It wasn't a delusion to them, it was simply how the world worked. Cunning women had real power. Curses could really harm. The devil was an active presence in the world, working through human agents. When that peddler had a stroke after Allison cursed him, it seemed like obvious proof. When misfortunes befell those who'd crossed the Devices or the Chattoxes, it confirmed what everyone already believed. And in times of crisis, and 1612 was absolutely a time of crisis, with the recent gunpowder plot and ongoing tensions between Protestants and Catholics, that fear became amplified. It became easier to believe in conspiracies, easier to see enemies everywhere, easier to accept children's testimony because surely children, in their innocence, couldn't lie about something so important. Roger Noel was ambitious and zealous, yes, but he wasn't unusual for his time. He was doing what many magistrates would have done, what they were encouraged to do by the king's own writings. The judges who presided over the trial weren't necessarily cruel. They were following the legal framework they'd been given, applying the standards of evidence that their culture accepted. Even Jennet, testifying against her family, we can understand how a terrified, vulnerable 9-year-old might have convinced herself that what she was saying was true, or might have seen cooperation as her only path to safety, or might have been shaped by adults who knew exactly what they needed her to say. None of this excuses what happened. 10 people died. Families were destroyed. A child was put in an impossible position with consequences she couldn't possibly have understood. But it does remind us that fear makes us capable of terrible things. It's tempting to think we're beyond all this now. We're rational. We're scientific. We don't believe in witches. But we still believe in evil. We still have our witch hunts, though we call them by different names. In the post-September 11th world, in the era of the War on Terror, we've seen how fear can lead to infringements of civil liberties, to detention without trial, to torture. All justified in the name of security. We've seen moral panics about satanic ritual abuse in the 1980s, based largely on questionable testimony from children. We've seen lives ruined by false accusations before cooler heads prevailed. We've seen how, in times of crisis, we can convince ourselves that the enemy is among us, that our neighbors might be threats, that extraordinary measures are justified. The details change. The specifics of what we fear evolve. But that fundamental human tendency to respond to fear by finding scapegoats, by accepting insufficient evidence, by believing the worst of each other, that hasn't gone away. What's changed is that we've developed better systems, scientific standards of evidence, legal protections, skepticism as a virtue rather than a vice. When William Harvey examined those women in 1634 and found no supernatural marks, he was applying the new scientific method. He was demanding physical, verifiable evidence instead of accepting superstition. When the Privy Council questioned Edmund Robinson and got him to admit he'd lied, they were doing what we'd now call critical thinking. They were testing claims, looking for corroboration, being willing to doubt. These tools, science, skepticism, rigorous standards of proof, are what eventually brought the witch-hunting era to an end. Not because people stopped believing in evil, but because we required better evidence before we'd act on those beliefs. I keep coming back to that image of Jennet Device standing on a table in the courtroom, a 9-year-old girl with the power to decide who lived and who died. She couldn't have understood what she was doing. Not really. Not in the way an adult would understand it. But her words had power nonetheless. They had the power to condemn, the power to create legal precedent, the power to echo across centuries. And perhaps that's the real lesson here. Not just about witchcraft and superstition, but about the power of narrative itself. Stories shape our reality. The stories we tell about each other, the stories we tell about threats and dangers, the stories we accept as true without questioning, these stories have consequences. Edmund Robinson's made-up tale about shape-shifting dogs and witch feasts led to 20 arrests, because it fit into an existing narrative about the evil lurking in Pendle. Jennet's testimony was believed not just because of what she said, but because it confirmed what people already thought they knew about the Device family, about cunning women, about the threat of witchcraft. The story of the gunpowder plot shaped how people interpreted the gathering at Malkin Tower, turning what might have been an Easter feast into evidence of conspiracy. We're not so different today. We still tell stories to make sense of the world. We still have narratives about who's dangerous and who's safe. We still sometimes believe things because they fit our existing fears, rather than because the evidence supports them. The challenge, then and now, is to maintain our humanity even when we're afraid. To demand real evidence. To protect the vulnerable. To be skeptical of simple answers to complex problems. And to remember that words have weight. That accusations have consequences. That once you've pointed a finger and said witch, or terrorist, or traitor, or whatever the modern equivalent might be, you can't take it back. The story of Jennet Device and the Pendle witches is 400 years old, but it still has something to teach us about fear, about justice, and about the shadows that fall across human nature when we stop questioning what we believe. In the shadow of Pendle Hill, where Malkin Tower once stood, the land is quiet now. But the questions the story raises, about truth and testimony, about children and power, about how we judge each other in times of fear, those questions remain as urgent as ever. Thank you for listening to this journey into the past. May we learn its lessons without having to repeat its tragedies.